We're thrilled to have so many of you on today. The last time Howard and I did this, we got up to about 100 people, which we thought was great. And this time we had over 500 people registered, so we're thrilled to have the audience. We are with our donors and funded scientists and folks from pharma and the NIA and the NIH and our partner Alzheimer's organizations, not only here in the United States, but across the globe. So it is wonderful to all be together. So that's one. Two, the purpose of today, or how it got set up, the wonderful folks in our philanthropy department came to us toward the beginning of the year. And they talked about, that we know there's going to be a lot of news on Alzheimer's drugs this summer, and perhaps we should get set up one of these town halls with myself and Howard in May, kind of before all the breaking news happens, although some of the news has started to break. So we're here to do that today, and then do know that after what we think will be a pretty heavy July of news, we'll be doing another one of these town halls to pick up from where we left off today. So again, thrilled to be here, thrilled to have you all here. Howard and I will do about a half hour of some Q&A between the two of us. Then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. And so please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function that you have. Just anytime you want, put a question in there, and we promise we're going to get to them during the Q&A session. Anything we don't get to, we will follow up with you directly on for an answer. So again, thrilled to be here. Howard, you and I have been doing a lot of traveling since the beginning of this year. We've been in Europe a couple of times. We've been out to the West Coast a couple of times. And a lot going on in the space. Really, Howard, I've heard you say this so many times, including most recently, 2 Sundays ago, front page of the Boston Globe on a Sunday when they said, finally, is the tide turning on Alzheimer's? And it was an article that was right underneath the masthead, and above the headline of the article was a pull quote from you, Howard, and talking again about how 40 plus years in all of this, you've never been so excited. So we're going to get into that today. There'll be a little bit of an emphasis on some breakthroughs that are happening with some of the amyloid drugs or anti-amyloid drugs. But we want to give context around all of that. So we're going to touch on, wow, a lot going on in diagnostics. Wow, a lot going on in prevention. We're going to talk about these 2 new therapies that seem to be getting a lot of attention in the news and some great hope coming out of them. And then we're going to be talking about something that anybody who's been around the ADDF for years now knows is our go-to, the biology of aging. And what we really see is going to be some of the ultimate solves to this problem that's been unsolvable up until now. So Howard, with all of that, why don't we get started with the diagnostics? And, Howard, I've heard you say many times now, we're at a point now where we can start seeing that somebody might have an issue 20 years in advance of the symptoms. And we know there are PET scans, and we know there's even a blood test. So can you give us a little bit about the latest going on in diagnostics right now?
Sure, Mark. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for spending time. When we were incorporated in 1998, one of our 3 pillars was diagnostics biomarkers. And it wasn't just to advance clinical care, which these new biomarkers have, but it was really to achieve our mission of accelerating drug development. The analogy I like to give is to the importance of biomarkers in disease drug development is imagine trying to develop a drug for hypertension if we didn't have a blood pressure cuff, which is a biomarker of high blood pressure. Or imagine trying to develop a drug for heart disease to reduce cholesterol if we couldn't measure cholesterol in the blood. And it's the same thing, but it's taking us about 40 years, 35 years to finally get the science done and have biomarkers for accelerating drug development for Alzheimer's disease. I've probably told this story many times, but the first biomarker that we invested in was a brain scan to detect the typical amyloid that's the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. Now, that brain scan was ultimately bought about 10 years after its first development at the University of Pennsylvania. by Eli Lilly for $800 million in milestone payments. And one would question why Lilly would buy it, but it turns out, to fast forward, not only did that test become the first FDA-approved diagnostic for Alzheimer's, which I use in my practice for clinical care, but also the accelerated approval that Aduhelm, the Biogen drug, lecanemab, the Eisai Biogen drug, and upcoming donanemab, which is the Lilly drug, they all work to remove amyloid from the brain. And the only way you can really see that right now with any certainty and visually and regionally is with that same biomarker, that PET scan that we first invested in 1999. So we've come a long way. I'm proud to say ADDF has played an important role. But the PET scans are really interesting because you can actually see the pathology in living persons. And in particular, the Lilly trial also used what's called a tau PET scan, which marks the tangles, which are the dying neurons in the brain. And Lilly used that tau PET scan alongside the amyloid PET scan to characterize patients who were entered into the trial in a very specific way, which I think led to a lot of their success in a clinically meaningful way. The thing about the brain scans is they're very expensive, and it requires a bit of an injection, and it takes a lot of time. We do have spinal fluid tests, measure a whole host of different things, including amyloid and tau, but other things that reflect inflammation in the brain, neurodegeneration, and other markers of inflammation. And so the spinal fluid tests are quite useful, but again, they require spinal tap and a little bit of invasion. People don't like to get them. So imagine if we could have a blood test. Well, the answer really briefly is we have a blood test. One of the companies that we invested in early on, about 15 years ago, named C2N, has a blood test on the market for Alzheimer's disease in 49 states in the United States. And that's really changing not only clinical care, I believe, because it'll put the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease into the mainstream of modern medicine with a blood test or approaches that are needed, such as cognitive testing. But because it only costs about $1,200 instead of $8,000 for the brain scan, it's going to have a big effect on the cost and the burden of doing clinical trials. And there are already clinical trials using the blood tests for beta amyloid and also tau in clinical trials, which is revolutionary. So last thing I'll say, Mark, so I don't want to belabor this too much, is we do have eye tests that we're investing in through the diagnostics.
Howard, let me just back up from that a second. First of all, phenomenal on the blood tests. Just as a frame for where you're going to go next, I think most on this call know we have something called the Diagnostic Accelerator, and that's a partnership that we do with Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Scott, as well as pharma partners like Biogen and Lilly that we have. And it's a $100 million effort. We're 4 years in. And I was just going to say, Howard, it's about three things, right? It's about, can we get blood tests to market? Can we get optical diagnostics to market? And can we get digital? So take it away, Howard, on the optical and the digital.
Yeah, so the blood tests are really good, but they're not as widely useful, especially for screening. So screening large populations of people, you want a test that's very safe and inexpensive and accurate. So imagine a world in maybe a year or two or three where when older people, let's say, go in for their annual eye exam, on the same machinery that the ophthalmologist uses to do your eye exam, there's a special camera, sits on top of the machine, and it automatically detects this beta amyloid protein that is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease in the back of the retina for about $120. That could be a really big breakthrough in detecting cases early in the community in an inexpensive and non-invasive manner. And we expect that the eye test using what's called hyperspectral imaging will also have other applications in detecting abnormal proteins in the back of the eye, because the back of the eye really is the window to the brain. And we know that there's pathology in the back of the eye in the retina in people with Alzheimer's disease. The other thing that we're trying to do which is prevalent in all diseases now in drug development and early detection, is digital biomarkers. And we're particularly blessed in a way in Alzheimer's disease because it's a disease of cognitive impairment. And we can pretty reliably detect cognitive impairment on a phone, on a digital phone, on an iPhone. It's pretty easy to test memory on an iPhone and do a whole bunch of other tasks on the phone or on your computer. Very inexpensive, very safe, useful for widespread screening of early detection in the community, and certainly useful in clinical trials, because right now, one of the problems in clinical trials is actually detecting the symptoms of the disease, the cognitive symptoms. You have to bring in a neuropsychologist, and they do a whole battery of cognitive tests, maybe once every month or once every 3 months. It takes a couple of hours. But the problem is the variability. If somebody has a poor night's sleep or they're depressed that day or whatever, we're not going to get the same test situation as you would get on a bright day. But with the iPhone type of testing, we can get so many more data points. You could be testing every hour, every day if we wanted to. We're not going to do that, of course. But we're going to get so many more data points. Instead of maybe 12 data points across a year, we're going to get 100 data points. And that's going to make the cognitive testing, which is the ultimate outcome of Alzheimer's drugs, much more reliable and precise. And the other thing that's amazing is that because the FDA actually requires or has required in cases of mild dementia, for example, that any cognitive benefit is accompanied by improvement in daily function. And right now, the way we measure daily function is by a questionnaire. You know, are you able to plan a meeting? Are you able to take public transportation? Just a verbal or a written questionnaire. But there's companies out there like Altoida that actually are using virtual reality on a phone to actually test somebody's ability to function using digital technology. And I think that's going to be another breakthrough that we're going to see in the marketplace and in clinical trials in the next year or 2 or 3. It's already out there, but I think we're going to start to see widespread use.
Yeah, terrific, Howard. And just a shout out also on the optical side to our friends from ReadySpec, and the other company on the digital side that you're first referring to is Cogstate. Howard, so this is the old question, right? Great, you can tell me if I'm going to have a problem, but what can I do about it? So Howard, let's start that on the prevention side and what can be done on prevention. And you know, we've been around that a lot this first couple of months of the year. We've been with Mia Kevapelto, but we've also been with a couple of docs here in the States. So Howard, give us the latest on prevention.
Well, there's been a lot of research over the last 40 years on risk factors. So head trauma, thyroid disease, maybe exercise. It hasn't all been brought together until recently. And some of the major advances are, for example, the PET scan. Mark, you mentioned how the amyloid as a biomarker, just like cholesterol, people have high cholesterol in their teenage years. And maybe they start developing plaque in their coronary arteries in their 20s and 30s, but they don't get that first heart attack till they're maybe 70 years old. But we can detect the cholesterol in a 30, 40-year-old and start doing prevention because we have the biomarker. And now we have that in Alzheimer's disease based on research using the blood test or using brain scan, PET scan. We can see that the disease starts 20, 30 years before symptoms, like in the 40s and 50s. So we can detect people that are asymptomatic, they don't have symptoms yet, but they have the disease, and we want to try to prevent the disease in those people. And so studies have been initiated using the monoclonal antibodies that have just been or are being brought to market, where there was a recent study of a very large study of people that had a very mild and modest amount of amyloid in their brain based on the PET scan, and it's pretty much I would call it our PET scan, that they have the pathology, but they don't have any symptoms, and then, or very, very mild symptoms, and then treating those people with the monoclonal antibodies to see if we can delay the onset of dementia or slow the rate of cognitive decline in these people that are kind of normal. And the first trial has read out, it hasn't really worked, but there's many other trials going on of this kind of approach of drugs that are specific for Alzheimer's, but also lifestyle interventions. So just like the same way that we think we can prevent heart disease through diet and exercise, and management of important medical comorbidities and risk factors like diabetes and hypertension, it seems that the saying we're using in the field is that what's good for your heart is good for your brain. And there's been very specific research, so some of which we've funded, looking at the role of exercise, for example, in slowing the rate of cognitive decline in older people. And there have been studies of the effect of a diet like a Mediterranean diet that's high in fruits and nuts and vegetables, to see if that has some effect based on the idea that maybe all the antioxidants in that food might have a protective effect on the brain. The most exciting studies have come out of Sweden, out of one of our board members and colleagues, Mia Kivipelto, who you mentioned, Mark. And she did a very famous study called the Finger Trial. And it was, the first randomized clinical trial of prevention possibility in our space. She had one experimental group where they got advice and supervision about having exercise. We're talking about brisk walking or, nothing extraordinary. Diet, mostly the Mediterranean diet, management of diabetes and hypertension, and adding on some sort of cognitive benefit, social engagement or computerized training, that kind of thing. And looking at the impact of that and doing something called implementation science. In other words, compliance is the hardest thing for this thing, making sure that if you're going to do a real research study, you want to make sure that people who are in the study are actually being compliant with the prevention regimen. So a real innovation in the Finger Trial is the compliance that they required every month, making sure that people actually complied with the prevention regimen. Whereas the control group just got some health education advice, typical of what a doctor or a nurse might do in a clinical practice. And there was statistically significant benefit in slowing the rate of cognitive decline in the people in the Finger Trial who received the treatment effect rather than compared to the people who just received the placebo. And one of our colleagues, Christine Yaffe at the University of California, San Francisco, is reporting these days, soon to come out, of her trial called the SMART trial, which actually looked at the possibility that if you use these 4 or 5 lifestyle and comorbidity management interventions, you could actually slow the rate of mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. I haven't seen the data yet, but it's quite interesting. And the importance of this is indicated by the fact that Mia's study has evolved into something called Worldwide Finger, and her study is being replicated in 49 countries around the world, because every country wants to see if this works in their population. And the last thing is that I think that's innovative going on now is something we're involved in, which is that just like in heart disease, we have prevention with lifestyle management and diabetes and hypertension management. We also give people statins to manage their major biological risk factor, which is cholesterol. Well, the same thing is going on now with a study called the MET-Finger study that we're invested in, using metformin, which has a number of effects on the aging process and in the aging brain. We actually funded a clinical trial of metformin for Alzheimer's disease several years ago with about $1 million. And Jose Luxenker up at Columbia just got a $40 million grant from the NIH to do another very large clinical trial of metformin for people with early Alzheimer's disease. So the Finger study is now Finger 2.0, which is the MET-Finger study, adding on lifestyle management, comorbidity management, and the leading anti-aging drug in the world, which is metformin.
Yeah, which just as excellent. There were a bunch of us from ADDF that were with me a couple of months ago and took 2 days to kind of tour her labs. And a couple of things with that. One, if I have my numbers right, they're up to 51 countries now with the Fingers Worldwide trial. Number one. And number two, stay tuned, all of you that are with us today. There's going to be some news coming out in the not too distant future about ADDF and the Fingers Health Institute, and a deepening of the relationship between the two organizations. Mia talks a lot these days about precision prevention, and I think that's the next chapter of this story we're going to hear about in prevention. So Howard, right? Great. We can diagnose early, and then we can now start answering the question, well, why would I want to know? Because there really are things you can do to push out, right, and delay, right? I think I've often heard you talk about, imagine if you could push out by months, if not years, any cognitive decline and what that might mean for you with your grandchildren and your loved ones and the ability to live independently. So, I guess hope's not on the horizon there. Hope is here. A little bit on the horizon, but getting closer and closer here now, Howard. We're seeing the first in 20 years, right? New treatments coming for Alzheimer's. And specifically here, Howard, I want to, if we could, for our audience today, focus in on the ASI drug and focus in on the Lilly drug. And because both are have been releasing data. One, we're going to hear about on the FDA if it's getting full approval or not on January 6th. The other, we're going to see some new full data on, and I think mid to late July. But Howard, take a step back and just talk about these, and you've talked about it a little bit. There is a certain type of drug now coming to market because of the way we're able to follow that drug inside clinical trials. So set the stage, and then first talk to us about the ASI drug, and then talk to us about the Lilly drug.
Sure, Mark. Well, let me first say the question about, do people know? And there have been surveys of people asking them whether they would want to know if they have it. And about 80 or 90% of people say they do want to know. And then the question becomes, is there a certain nihilism about knowing because there's nothing you can do? But, as a practitioner who's been taking care of people with Alzheimer's almost 45 years now, I can tell you that there's almost always something that we can do to help patients and their families to deal with the diagnosis, to make sure that patients have quality of life throughout the course of the illness, to do things that make sure that people don't have unnecessary worsening, how to deal with the various vagaries of the disease, the caregiving aspects, the advanced care planning, the estate planning issues, where do people live? There's just so many aspects of care, plus just providing currently available drugs. And now that we can make a very precise diagnosis with these biomarkers and detect people that have amyloid in the brain, we can really tailor patients who would be eligible, who first of all have a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease because they have this amyloid in their brain, and also tau and tangles, which we can get into. But the two drugs that you mentioned, actually three, the Biogen drug Aduhelm, the Eisai Biogen drug called Leqembi, and the Lilly drug called donanemab, it doesn't have a brand name yet. All three drugs seem to do the same thing, which is they remove the amyloid from the brain. And we can see that in clinical trials at between 12 and 18 months, as we repeat the brain scans, the amyloid signal that was first detected is gone. In 60 to 80% of patients, it's gone. And so that seems to be associated with some clinical benefit in terms of slowing the rate of decline of symptoms of the disease and progression of the disease by somewhere between 25 and 35%, depending on which antibody and which study we're talking about. In the latest study, the Lilly drug actually slowed the rate of functional decline by 40%. And that really gets us into a degree of improvement, which I think few would argue is not, few would argue that it is not clinically meaningful. In other words, to say it in a positive way, I think most would agree that a 40% slowing in the rate of functional decline in patients is clinically meaningful, and pushes out, as you said, Mark, the amount of time that people have to enjoy their grandchildren, enjoy their lives. And these are generally older people whose life expectancy is limited, of course, by their age. And the way I like to think of it is, if somebody's 75 or 80, their life expectancy is 6 or 8 years. And if we can give them what I call an improvement in their cognitive life expectancy of 1 or 2 or 3 years. That's a big change. I mean, if we made similar comparisons along the lines of cancer drugs, I think we'd be as good as or better than a lot of cancer drugs with maybe not as many side effects, quite frankly. So I think the brain scan actually enabled a rigorous test of what we call the amyloid hypothesis for the first time. Does amyloid really play a role in the disease? And I think it did. It's pretty clearly proven that the amyloid not only plays a role in the disease, but can be treated with these antibodies. And the exciting thing is that this is just the first step. It's maybe 35% slowing. But the next step is going to be adding more drugs, just like in cancer and hypertension. We have patients on 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 medications at a time to really treat the disease. Right now, we've got 2 or 3 medications in our armamentarium, and I think it's going to change rapidly in the next 5 years or so. So it really is an exciting time from the big picture. And I think that people with memory problems who look like they have early dementia should get a definitive diagnosis for many reasons, not just clinical care, but to determine whether or not they really have Alzheimer's disease and whether or not they're eligible for these drugs that I believe are going to come to market and can slow the rate of decline of the illness.
And Howard, can you talk a little bit about the ASI drug, where it is in an approval process right now, and its effect, and also then talk a little bit about the Lilly drug and where it is in its reading out data process right now?
Yeah, it's quite amazing. About 2 weeks ago, I was talking to a family, and they wanted to try one of the drugs. And so I started looking into how I could prescribe the drugs in Manhattan. And so I spoke to the companies that manufacture and distribute the ESI drug, for example. And it turns out it's actually available. Now, its availability is quite limited because Medicare, even though FDA approved the drug, Medicare basically declined to pay for it. And there's a lot of controversy around that. But
this is the Biogen drug you're talking about, right, Howard?
It looks like it's going to be at least the Biogen drug and the ESI drug. Both got what's called an accelerated approval, which means that Medicare, that's an FDA designation that the FDA recognized that the drug had the impact on the biomarker, and that it was likely that because it had an impact on the amyloid in the brain on the PET scan, that there would be clinical benefit. But then Medicare gave it what's called a coverage with evidence development, which means that they're not going to pay for everyone to get the drug. They're only going to pay for it for people who go into a clinical trial. So instead of maybe 100,000 or 200,000 people who are estimated to qualify, and maybe even a lot more for the drug in clinical care, we're talking about maybe tens of thousands of people at most who would be able to enroll in some registries and get access to the drug that Medicare might pay for. But it was a very limited payment approval. The fact is that it's actually created a 2-tiered system for the treatment of Alzheimer's, which is very unfortunate because people who have Medicare and don't have assets can't afford to pay privately, so they would have to enroll in one of these registries to get into to get access to the treatment. Whereas wealthy people can, and the drug costs about $28,000 a year, plus the infusion center costs. Wealthy people who can afford to pay will be able to purchase the drug at an infusion center and get access to the drug. So in some ways, the drug, ESI's drug, is currently clinically available, but the availability is very limited by the payment method. The Lilly drug, which seems to be the most effective at this point, in some ways, hasn't gone through the FDA full approval process, but I think there's some hope that rather than getting accelerated approval, which will be limited and limit the payment, that the Lilly drug has the data that's good enough that hopefully it'll get a full approval, typical of other drugs in all other diseases. And if there's full approval, I think it would be highly unprecedented for Medicare not to pay for the drug. And there's a fairly good expectation that if the Lilly drug called donanemab gets a full approval from the FDA, then Medicare will pay pay for the administration of the drug to patients who qualify.
Right. And Howard, and check me if I have it wrong, for the A-side drug that they're doing in partnership with Biogen, we are expecting on July 6th, I believe is the date, is for a potential full approval from the FDA. And also that CMS has come out and said that they will they will reimburse for both this A-side drug as well as whatever happens with the Lilly drug if it gets fully approved based on what the label says. Do I have that right?
Well, usually Medicare pays for what the label says. So I think it very much depends on what kind of label the FDA comes out with. As I understand it, the label for the E-side drug, Leqembi, didn't actually restrict the drug to stage of disease. I think there was some, I've read some issues about that. So while the science would say that it should just be administered to patients with mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia, there may be some indications that the FDA label could be interpreted as being broader than that. But I'm sure that's going to be clarified as the drugs come to market.
Got you. Okay. Let's kind of a last thing here, and it goes that we know we've been talking to the folks from Lilly. They're also talking about potentially having a companion diagnostic come out with their drug. What's the importance of something like a companion diagnostic to these drugs?
Well, I think it facilitates the availability of the diagnostics in the clinical market. Right now, it's very limited, and it's mostly just the C2N blood test. But there are several other blood tests out there, including a blood test for tau, which is abnormal in the blood of patients with Alzheimer's and comprises the tangles that represent the dying neurons in the brain of Alzheimer patients. So I think having a companion diagnostic kind of packages the diagnostic test, which is specific for not only Alzheimer's disease, but for the target of the drug with the administration of the drug. So it's kind of like the company itself is able to market a complete set of diagnostic and therapeutic products in one package, let's say. And I think that makes it easier for clinicians to administer the drug because of the way that things are packaged and for.
Yeah, and I know, we spend a lot of time on the diagnostic front at ADDF, and one of the things that's becoming apparent to us as the FDA starts approving these drugs, the diagnostics, in particular, who does not get the drug, who is the drug not for, becomes very important. I think we're going to see a lot around diagnostics with these approvals. All right, Howard, let's pivot to the biology of aging, because if you look at this, the A-side drug, the Lilly drug, somewhere, let's just call it around 30% effective. That leaves 70% that still is not being addressed here. And our goal is to get to 100%. So, Howard, we like to say that there are over 120 clinical trials in Alzheimer's going on right now. 75% of them have nothing to do with non-amyloid pathways, or with amyloid pathways, but rather with diverse non-amyloid pathways. So, and that's where the bulk of ADDF's funding is going. Of all of our funding last year, 87% went to clinical trials, and then were these diverse clinical trials. So many of them are in phase 2. We're seeing some in phase 3. We know we have interest in scientific meetings that are coming up, whether it's CTAD in the fall or ADPD next year, that the biology of aging is going to be a centerpiece at these meetings. So, talk a little bit about the non-amyloid trials that are going on and the importance of them. What are some of the more exciting things that you're seeing, and really, paint us into the picture of why combined therapies and precision medicine are really going to be the solve here.
Yeah, so we've been, since our founding 25 years ago, We've been interested in multiple pathways, recognizing that aging is the leading risk factor by far for Alzheimer's disease. And so most diseases of aging have fundamentally similar mechanisms, inflammation, for example, being one of them. And so from the very beginning, while we funded a few anti-amyloid programs, once there was enough momentum in the anti-amyloid research that big pharmaceutical companies could come in and spend literally tens of billions of dollars over the last 3 decades in anti-amyloid research, that even it further increased our incentives and our interest in non-amyloid therapies to advance the field. And so over the last 35 years or so, sorry, 25 years, we've made big investments in non-amyloid pathways to advance the field. And this is finally coming of age, as you said, Mark. We've been framing our work in the context of what we call the biology of aging, because aging research called gerontology, and specifically biological gerontology, has been going on for over 100 years, whereas Alzheimer's therapeutics work has really only been going on about 30, 35 years. So there's just a tremendous amount about the biology of aging that could be translated into new drugs for Alzheimer's disease as new targets are discovered in the aging process, and where they have relevance in the aging brain. And so, for example, whereas when I started in the early 1980s, excuse me, I'm sorry. I used to talk about inflammation because I'm a geriatrician and a gerontologist. And I used to say, you know, that the plaques around the brain actually have inflammatory cells around them. That was described by Alzheimer's in 1906. So we knew that there were inflammatory cells in the brain from the very beginning, but never thought of them as a target. And when I tried to point this out to some investigators at the NIH in the early 80s, they basically pretty much kicked me out of the room. But I can tell you now that the whole field is really interested in inflammation now in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. And there's a couple of reasons. First, it's an advancement in the basic science of the role of inflammation in various brain diseases, but also studies showing that people that have inflammation in their brain actually progress more rapidly. And we talk about this phenomenon of people that have amyloid in their brain and might die with amyloid in their brain, but never actually get symptoms. And what are those so-called resilience factors that enable people who have amyloid in their brain not to develop the disease per se, the symptoms? And it appears to be that one of the key factors is inflammation. And so we've been sponsoring clinical trials and even some preclinical research on the role of inflammation in trying to slow the process of the disease. And it's been interesting right now. We're funding a company out of Cleveland Clinic called Neurotherapia that has some really interesting small molecules that they've shown safety in phase 1. We've been funding them for about 10 years now to show that this anti-inflammatory drug that's specific for the brain actually might slow the disease down. And we're trying to help them raise money for the phase 2 study. So that's one example of a very novel program. And it's interesting because that drug is in the class of drugs called cannabinoids derived from the cannabis family, but this is a synthetic small molecule. And the reason it's interesting is because there are 2 types of cannabis receptors or cannabinoid receptors in the brain. And one of them is the psychotropic one that makes people high, but the other one is actually an inflammatory signal. And so by blocking that signal, it's possible to reduce the amount of inflammation in the brain of patients with Alzheimer's. So a very interesting approach to inflammation. Several others. There's a drug on the market called Enbrel for rheumatoid arthritis, and we've been we funded a study of repurposing that drug for Alzheimer's, and it does appear that in the small trials that have been done, that it slows it down. Another related pathway in aging that's fundamental to the aging process and important in Alzheimer's is oxidation. And people have long tried to take antioxidants for the treatment of disease, vitamin E, vitamin C, and so on. And it's never really been shown that any antioxidant really slows down the course of any disease using supplements. And two trials come to mind that we're funding that I think are quite interesting on the what's called oxidative stress. One is a company out of the Netherlands that we've invested in that has an oral formulation of a drug that first came out in Japan for the treatment of ALS. And it's a very powerful antioxidant called edaverone. And it proved in Japan for the treatment of stroke and ALS, and here in the United States for the treatment of ALS. And we're repurposing that drug for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm actually quite excited about it. I think if it works, it'll be a big breakthrough. And it's an example of how repurposing can really have an impact on accelerating the development of drugs. The other supplement that we're using that has an effect on metabolic processes is a supplement called benfotiamine. And that we funded at Weill Cornell several years ago. And it showed that this derivative of thiamine that actually helps thiamine get into the brain into pathways that are fundamental to the metabolism of the brain actually works. And the clinical trial has been published and shown to be effective. And again, it was an example where about $2 million of seed money to the academic investigator resulted in about a $30 million grant from the National Institute on Aging to do a much larger trial. So those are, kind of two really good examples of, processes involved in the fundamental aging process, inflammation and oxidation, where we're trying to translate that idea and drugs that are available to treat those two pathways into treatments for Alzheimer's disease.
So Howard, that's excellent. And I know you and I can go on and, there's at least a dozen other examples here of presently what's in the portfolio, but we're getting a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So let me try to do a couple of these rapid fire and see how we do, okay? So we have one question here, germane into kind of the biology of aging direction. Howard, how do you measure the level of inflammation in the brain?
Well, that's a great question. So there's two ways that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't know where that expression comes from, but but one is, as I said, that Alzheimer described in 1906 that there's inflammatory cells around the plaques. Imagine if in the same way that you can see the plaques with the PET scan, you could see the inflammatory cells in the brain, which aren't normally there, or if they're there, they're not activated. So there's one, what we call ligand. A ligand is a molecule that you would use, you'd radio label it, inject it into the vein of a patient. It would go up into the brain and bind the amyloid and light up because it's radioactive, microdose of radioactivity, not dangerous at all. It would light up on the PET scan. Well, imagine if there was a ligand that you could inject that would bind to these inflammatory cells and light up in a PET scan. Well, there is. There's one called TSPO, which is not a very good ligand, but it's being used. We're funding a company that's trying to develop a better TSPO. And there's at least two other examples of that. But the other thing is that we can also see some very specific indicators of inflammation in the brain, not just on brain scans, but also in the spinal fluid. Molecules like GFAP and YKL-40, which are indicative of inflammation in the brain. And what we're trying to do, which has been a little harder, is see if we can develop blood tests that are specific to inflammation in the brain. And that's a little bit harder because there is a lot of systemic inflammation around, and so it kind of confounds the issue by looking at blood. But we're hopeful that we can find a blood test that will be indicative of brain inflammation. And so that's one of the things that the diagnostics accelerator is quite interested in.
Okay, a couple more questions here, Howard, or there's a lot more questions here. First of all, on the questions, folks, if yours is a personal question about your own health, we can do that with Dr. Fillit kind of offline. And I suspect we're going to run out of time to answer all the questions. Do know we'll get back to every one of you with an answer, but just pulling some out of the queue here, Howard. So here's one question from the audience. How does metformin work in the framework of dealing with aging?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing about metformin, one major thing that it does is it improves what's called insulin resistance. So in particular in the brain, with aging, the brain is about 3% of the body weight, but at any given moment, it's the most metabolically active organ in the body and uses about 20% of the body's energy, primarily through oxygen and glucose. So one of the examples I like to give about how dependent the brain is on glucose is that when a diabetic takes too much insulin, the first thing that happens is they go unconscious. And then if you can somehow get them to suck on a candy or some orange juice, they kind of wake up. That's how dependent the brain is on glucose. Now with aging, insulin helps glucose get into cells so that it can be used metabolically. But with aging, and certainly with diabetes, there's insulin resistance. And so that's why metformin and other drugs like semaglutide and liraglutide, which has a lot of play right now, these drugs that are used for diabetes can be repurposed to see if we improve brain insulin resistance, we can improve cognition and slow the rate of neurodegeneration, because when cells are not getting enough energy, they're going to become dysfunctional and ultimately die. But the thing about metformin is that it also affects some other fundamental cellular processes. Many of them actually have been shown. And so in the world of biology of aging and in what's called translational geroscience, metformin is considered like the #1 drug for anti-aging because of many different things that it does in the cell to preserve cellular function. And I don't have time to go into all of those, but quite interesting. And it's very inexpensive. It's also generic throughout the world. So it's inexpensive. It's quite safe. Whether I would prescribe it for people who are just aging, probably not. It would be quite off-label. But we are looking at, as I mentioned earlier, including metformin in the Finger 2.0 trial.
All right, so Howard, time for 2 more questions, and I have them both lined up here. So the first question that comes in, because there's some real interest in this, and I know it's a wheelhouse for you. What about, what kind of clinical trials are going on in the vascular sphere?
Yeah, the vascular is really important, not only with aging, like as we age up to when we're 65, 70, 80% of people have some sort of vascular disease and cerebral vascular disease. So it's very common. And there is an entity called vascular dementia or vascular cognitive impairment. Kind of goes back to the old term of hardening of the arteries, basically. And it turns out that was true. And about 50% of people in the community with cognitive impairment or dementia have what's called mixed dementia, which means that they have evidence of Alzheimer's disease, but they also have vascular disease as well that can be contributing to the progression of their dementia. And people that have both tend to progress a little more quickly than people that just have Alzheimer's disease. So, treatment would be treatment of the risk factors. So treatment of diabetes and hypertension and cholesterol and atherosclerosis and so on, even in people that have or especially, let's say, people that have Alzheimer's disease. But what we're trying to do is think about novel mechanisms that actually look at the linkage between vascular disease and Alzheimer's. Like, for example, how would peripheral vascular disease contribute to plaques and tangles in the brain? And the long and short answer is that we've invested in a company called Therini, which is out in California. We actually helped the company to start by funding some basic research at Rockefeller University here in New York. And the investigator on that moved to San Francisco and started this company. And the company has some really interesting technology. It's a monoclonal antibody to a specific region of a coagulation protein called fibrin that binds amyloid very tightly. And when it binds amyloid very tightly in the blood vessel, it creates these seeds that become highly inflammatory and open up the blood-brain barrier and are thought to be the linkage in some ways between vascular damage and the ultimate neuronal duration, the ultimate neurodegeneration that occurs around that occurs in the aging brain, and kind of links this vascular problem with the pathology of Alzheimer's disease.
So Howard, last question, and this is a short one, and I think we often get this one, but of everything you can do kind of for prevention, right? What is the most important thing of the lifestyle interventions that you can do for prevention?
I think that the most effective thing you can do is try to do all of most of the lifestyle things. I'm not trying to hedge on the answer. I think that exercise has an impact and is very important. We could go into why. I think diet has an important, and I think particularly for preventing dementia, social engagement, occupational engagement is really important. And I really think that the evidence for social isolation being bad for people and bad for your brain is quite impressive. So I think that the biggest impact will be from really leading a healthy lifestyle that includes exercise. And we're not talking about marathon running. We're talking about a 45-minute walk 3, 4, 5 times a week. With diet, we're talking about eating a lot of fruit and vegetables and nuts, and with social engagement, I mean, try not to be sitting home alone. Go to your senior center, engage in volunteering, don't retire, stay on the internet if you can. I think all of these lifestyle things, if you have hearing loss, wear your hearing aid, get a hearing aid. If you have vision loss, make sure that you have adequate vision from your glasses, because vision and hearing loss are risk factors as well. So I think the more risk factors that you manage through lifestyle, the better off people will be.
Well, we have a ton more questions in the queue, but we're never going to be able to answer them all. So we promise all the questions out there, we will get back to you directly. Any last questions or thoughts from your side, Howard?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the Boston Globe had us on the front page, thanks to everyone that made that effort. And it said that I've never been more excited than I am now. And I know I probably don't look too excited, but but I am excited. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I remember when I started, nobody ever heard of Alzheimer's disease. They'd kind of look at me cross-eyed and say, old-timers disease? I never heard of old-timers disease. And, now it's the disease everyone's rightfully so afraid of. But I think the advancement in my professional lifetime of the science and the therapeutics is just amazing. And we have the first disease-modifying therapeutics on the market essentially today. And it's incredible. I just think it's amazing that we've come that far, and I think the advancements are just going to accelerate in the coming years.
Yeah, and let me finish this for folks. With the ADDF, it's our 25th anniversary since Howard started the organization with Leonard and Ronald Lauder, as Howard likes to say, with a desk and a chair. And we've watched this science come a long way, and now we're really on the precipice here, which is phenomenal. Many of you may have seen, but if you haven't, I just want to mention that the Lauder family, in celebration of the 25th anniversary, as a family, have made a $200 million contribution to the organization to take care of the organization's expenses for the next 10 to 15 years, so that we can say for the next 10 to 15 years, all of your money and donations goes directly to the science. And they pegged it this way because they wanted to finish what their mother and their grandmother, Estee Lauder, started with the ADDF 25 years ago. And it's a true belief with the Lauder family that what we're seeing now in diagnostics and preventions, the first treatments, but particularly in the biology of aging, that this is going to be prevention, combined therapies, and precision, that in the next 10 to 15 years, we will have solves that have never existed before. So we want to thank all of you for being part of this. And there's a special 25th anniversary video that we're just going to queue up for you all today. And I hope that, it's about 5 minutes long. Take the time to watch it. I'll come back right at the end of it. But think of yourselves, whether you're a donor, whether you're a scientist, it's because of you we're at this moment. And if we could please have the video now.
For me, Alzheimer's is very personal. My mother passed away from Alzheimer's a little over 2 years ago. My mother-in-law passed away from early onset Alzheimer's.
One day, you're vibrant and wonderful and have the whole world ahead of you, and the next morning you wake up and you say, uh-oh, something's not right. I remember that happening to my father.
My dad had to go into a nursing home. It was very difficult. I brought my children to visit him. We had nice visits. He kind of knew who we were.
I was really close with my maternal grandmother. It was really devastating for somebody that taught me so many things in life that toward the end, she didn't even know who we were.
In my mother's case, she was a college professor and an established artist, a woman who spoke 6 languages fluently. There's no one who can prepare you for this journey, to watch someone you love basically fade before your eyes.
Every story is different but the same. The loss of somebody that was dear to us. The person's there, but they're not there.
I love my mother. And here's a woman who had such light in her eyes and power. She knew something was wrong. My late wife, Evelyn, came in to see her in her home one afternoon and said, "Esty, we miss you in the office." She turned to her and answered her, "I miss me too." What that did for me and for my brother Ronald, it energized us to say, okay, we have to fight this disease and we have to do everything we can to prevent it.
Leonard and Ronald Lauder founded the ADDF because of their own mother's experience with Alzheimer's. The genius of what they have done is to have had the vision to bring together the top scientific talent in the world and then partnering with drug companies and the community most affected by Alzheimer's.
They brought their idea that we should solve this through a very innovative model called venture philanthropy, in which we should be funding things that have the potential to pay off and give us returns so that we can fund other ideas.
When ADDF started about 25 years ago, it was 1998. We had accumulated some knowledge about the disease, but there were basically only 1 or 2 drugs on the market at that time, and they were not very effective. This is a chronic, progressive, uniformly fatal neurodegenerative illness of the human mind. It robs people of their humanity.
Dr. Howard Fillit, who was our scientific director, came up with using an amyloid PET scan and a blood test, both of which gave you a positive diagnosis. Then you could work on trying to cure it or prevent it.
And through the Diagnostics Accelerator and other partners like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mackenzie Scott, the Dolby family, as well as the Lauders, we are putting $100 million towards new biomarkers. That is paving the way for interesting results in new therapeutics.
We're developing biomarkers to identify people that have amyloid in the brain, people that have other biomarkers of Alzheimer's like the tangles, inflammation, genetic markers, and tailor medications against those pathways, translating the biology of aging into new therapeutics to stop Alzheimer's in its tracks.
The ADDF recognizes that there is an underlying biology, and to make major advances, we need to target that underlying biology. There might not be a lot of support for something that hasn't been proven over and over and over again, but that's not innovative. Innovative is discovering something new and developing a plan to attack it. Everything from discovery in the lab to early stage clinical trials, wearable devices, healthy aging interventions.
That's why I'm so excited right now, because this is harvest time. It's time to harvest all of this knowledge. Tens of thousands of research reports. We've got 120 drugs in clinical trials right now for Alzheimer's disease. That's amazing.
Technology is allowing us to map the brain at a resolution that we've never done before. If you think of Google Maps, you see a city and you can zoom in to street level view. And that's what we're doing now with the brain. Not only see the houses, but open the door in those houses and take a step in so we're able to really understand what is happening deep inside how that cell works, and then map it.
The adversity of Alzheimer's has brought out the best of humanity in all of us. That's what I see at the ADDF.
It's a really diverse group of people from different backgrounds and different professions, but are really united along the mission of ending Alzheimer's.
When you look back over the last 25 years and see just how far we've come, it's astonishing. Here we have a community of scientists and doctors and donors to fight this horrible disease. And for the first time, there truly is hope.
Any academic success that you might have, that is not why I do what I do. It is because there are people with this disease that need hope, and hope is here.
Hope is here. Believe me, hope is here.
Hope is here. To all of our scientists who've been on it with us today, thank you for bringing us to this moment. For all of our donors, thank you for fueling this moment. Hope is here. We'll be back to you later in the summer. Thank you all for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you.